Что же, здравствуйте, уважаемые коллеги. Я очень рада приветствовать вас на 5-м международном симпозиуме «Образование и город. Третья миссия университета», который проходит в эти дни в Московском городском педагогическом университете. Сегодня у нас в гостях профессор Генри Дженкинс. Думаю, он не нуждается в долгих представлениях. Исследования Генри Дженкинса хорошо известны в нашей стране, несмотря на то, что только одна его книга переведена на русский язык. Поэтому я буквально через минуту передам слово Генри, чтобы не занимать его время, но сначала хочу напомнить наш регламент. Лекция продлится примерно 45 минут, так мы договорились с Генри. Просим на это время выключить микрофоны и камеры. Если у вас появляются вопросы в процессе лекции, пожалуйста, пишите их в чат на русском или на английском языке. После лекции профессор Дженкинс ответит на ваши вопросы. Мы заранее уже передали ему вопросы, которые вы присылали при регистрации. Возможно, на некоторые из них он ответит уже в ходе лекции. Но остальные вопросы, если авторы их присутствуют в зале, я обязательно задам после лекции, а также, конечно, если хватит времени, то и вопросы из чата. На время сессии вопросов тоже прошу вас включить камеры, чтобы создать ощущение, что все-таки у нас с вами общение довольно-таки непосредственное. Лекция будет проходить на английском языке с синхронным переводом. Для включения перевода нажмите кнопку «Перевод» на панели управления звуком и выберите русский язык. При этом звук лекции будет приглушен. Если он вам мешает, там есть также опция «Выключить оригинальный звук». Ну а теперь я выключаюсь и передаю слово Генри Дженкинсу. Henry, you are welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I very much had wished that I could join you in person today. Originally, I was planning to be in Moscow about this time, but obviously circumstances have intervened and made that more difficult. But that trip would have been the outgrowth of a fascination I've had with the Russian people and Russian culture going back to my early teens, which would have been in the 1970s. Today, I'm going to speak from an American perspective. I do not know what portion of what I will say may be pertinent to your circumstances there. And I'm trusting you to make those connections in whatever way makes sense to you. I come with great humility because so often Americans go around the world telling other people what to think, and I don't like to do that, but I do like to share ideas, and I look forward to hearing your questions and perhaps some thoughts you have about the material I'm going to talk about. So this talk is called Imagining Better Futures, the work of the Civic Imagination Project. And the first set of images on these slides represent a very contemporary imagination of what the ideal world of the future might look like. They're images that come out of the solar punk movement, which has been a global science fiction movement to think about sustainable futures where we have found new ways to relate to the environment. I know that there's great work on this being done in Korea and Brazil, in Japan and India. I don't know what work may be going on there in Russia, except to know that your country has had a strong science fiction tradition going back at least as far as the late 19th, early 20th century. So it seems likely work is going on there, but I don't have, it's not been visible to me here. But what I'm using these images to do is just suggest that our ideas about the future change constantly, that the work of the Civic Imagination Project has been strongly inspired by science fiction and science fiction fandom, and that our work involves taking those methods and applying them to communities, both in the United States and elsewhere, that are seeking some kind of civic renewal, some new way of connecting to each other. So let me start by describing the distinction we make in our work between the civic and the political. So the civic are the social, cultural ties people in a community have to each other. It's the mutual dependencies we build with each other which allow us to go about our everyday life and feel a sense of connection to other people in our community. Whereas politics is more partisan. It depends on distribution of power. It's more likely to generate stronger disagreements. And in some ways, what we're seeing in the United States is that an intensification of the political is wearing down the civic infrastructure, which allow us to connect with each other as neighbors, as members of a community, as fellow citizens, and so forth. And so our project seeks to figure out how we rebuild that trust, how we work across political divides in order to talk to each other in less abrasive and antagonistic ways. So what does this imagination have to do with that? Well, in our work, we've kind of broken down the functions of the imagination as it relates to the civic. So it starts with the premise that before we can create a better world, we need to imagine what a better world looks like. And I have here two images. One is another of the solar punk futures, what a city might look like as imagined by solar punk artists. And the other is Wakanda from the Black Panther film. And Wakanda has been seen by many Black Americans as an idealized vision of what an African society might look like. One that escapes many of the stereotypes people have about Africa. It's a country that was never colonized. It's a country that has vast resources and technological development and has avoided tribal warfare, has created a space for women, and is beginning to assert itself as a global leader. And that speaks particularly to African American students, in fact, much more than it speaks to people in Africa, because it allows them to maintain a connection back to their mother country, while also having an image of that country that fits well for them in a 21st century context. The second function is you must imagine yourself as a civic agent capable of making a difference. And if we look around the world, we've seen the superhero imagery extending into celebration of emergency workers, medical workers, others who have helped the community during the pandemic. In part because they've looked for ways to mobilize the mass in relation to heroic imagery. And at the current time, the most heroic imagery involving mass is the superhero. But it's about community service. The next function is you need to imagine a process of change. And here I see this, I found this image that's meant to reflect the role of books and education as a resource in the life of young people that might come together to help them understand the world in new terms. So education is one model of a process of change. Can we make generational change through what we teach our students, how we teach our students, and so forth? Also, we need to imagine yourself as part of a community with shared interest. And here we have a community garden, which took on new importance in the United States during the pandemic because people could get out of doors, not be trapped indoors. They could work at a distance from each other, but be working toward a common task, and that helped hold communities together during some of the turmoil and disruption caused by the pandemic in 2020. We have to forge solidarity with groups whose perspectives are different from our own. And these are young K-pop fans who have become ambassadors for Korea around the world and have connected with young people in many countries. In the United States, especially, we see lots of interplay between the Korean fans of K-pop music, K-pop, Korean cinema, Korean television, and these young fans, and development of shared rituals, shared values at the intersection through popular culture. So This is some representations of the Civic Imagination Project. It's funded by the MacArthur Foundation. It's a project I had along with Sangeeta Shrestova at the University of Southern California. And I'm going to break down a little bit what we do, how we take those ideas about the civic imagination and put them into practice. So one of the ideas that drives this is the sense of what is the value of utopia. And Stephen Duncombe, who's a friend and colleague of mine, writes, we need utopian thinking because without it, we are constrained by the tyranny of the possible. And his idea of the tyranny of the possible is that sense that the ideas we have in our heads that limit our capacity to dream. And it may be something to do with the current conditions of government in our society. So in America, there's a sense of too much partisanship. And that often blocks us from working together with our neighbors to achieve common goods. And so it's whatever that voice in your head says, this would be an astonishing thing, but it's just not possible. Utopian thinking for Duncombe is not a blueprint. It's not a guide for literally what government we want to make. It's a provocation for thought, for conversation, for dialogue. It's an ideal world that's meant to fall apart when we tug on it, but is meant to get us thinking together about what the promises of the future might be, what our hopes and aspirations are, what our fears and anxieties are, as we think about what a better world might be for ourselves and our children. Another writer who influences us a lot is the Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, who tells us the imagination that takes us to the possible and impossible dreams is always necessary. It is important to make it clear that imagination is not an exercise for those detached from reality, those who live in the air. On the contrary, when we imagine something, we do it necessarily conditioned by a lack in our concrete reality. So for Freire, the striving toward the imagination is a response to the material conditions that surround you. And he was working with young people in the favelas in Sao Paulo and Rio to help them think differently about their conditions and to maybe articulate some of the problems they encountered in their everyday life in a language that might allow them to be heard. And for him, that was the highest goal of education, was to help people imagine together new conditions that would improve the quality of their life and to learn to find the voice to articulate those imaginings. So how we approach civic imagination, and it's rooted in what I call participatory cultures. And participatory cultures, in an educational sense, are communities that come together, that teach each other, that support each other's creative development, their civic voices, that are spaces of learning. I often talk about fandom as such a space because fans learn to write stories, make costumes, compose music that extends upon popular media that matters to them. So we build on fan practices through our work. We are interested in critical and creative engagements with popular culture, things that use popular media at their roots as a way of articulating shared fantasies of the utopia and the future. And we're committed to a collective imagination rather than a personalized or individual imagination. For us, it's about imagining communities, groups of people coming together to think otherwise about the world. And it's about people who have agency in some way, maybe not at all levels, but some flicker of agency in their lives, which allow them to make changes, at least at the most local level effect or the level of personal life. And it's about connections between cultural practices and civic and political action. So we've translated this research into a series of books. Our most recent ones are Pop Culture and the Civic Imagination, which is case studies of creative social change. And here we see George Washington, a kind of playful imagery of George Washington, transforming himself into various figures from popular culture, from Frankenstein to Star Wars, to Harry Potter, to wrestling, to Wonder Woman, to Thanos, right? Who is this iconic figure from American history, and how might he imagine his relationship? Given that early on, George Washington was often depicted wearing a toga, right? Which George Washington never actually wore as an historical figure, but was meant to connect him back to the classical Greek and Roman world, because the people he was speaking to were often educated elites who knew the shared languages of Latin and Greek, and therefore imagining him as Apollo spoke to their civic project in helping to create the United States. So if we imagine him, George Washington in a toga as cosplay George, then these are other costumes we might imagine George Washington wearing today. In that book, we provide a series of case studies of popular media franchises and various movements that are civic and in some cases political in nature. But it's what are these groups doing with Beyonce, with Bollywood, with Hunger Games, with Star Wars, with Smokey the Bear, and with Marvel superheroes? How do they become tools for communities coming together and transforming themselves? And each of these images represents a particular case study in the book. We have altogether about 30 case studies in the book. So within ethical and civic boundaries, we work with diverse groups and across differences to bring communities together to think about the future, to imagine different kinds of worlds we might want to live in. And as you can see here, in some cases that results in crafts, some cases it results in some media production. In every case, it results in world building and storytelling and remixing. And we've done it in mosque, we've done it in church fellowship halls, we've done it in labor halls. We worked with sex workers in Los Angeles, and we've worked with coal miners and tobacco farmers in Kentucky. We worked with middle school kids and with senior citizens, and often trying to bridge between those. Our goal is not a particular political one. We work with all kinds of groups. We're not going to work with hate groups, but we will work with almost any other kind of group that wants to invite us in and take seriously some of the processes and projects I'm about to describe. Out of those workshops has come a second book, Practicing Futures, a Civic Imagination Action Handbook, that illustrates the workshops that we have been involved with. It has instructions for educators, after school programs, community groups to apply those and adapt those exercises for their own community. So we've done those workshops. We've now turned, having published that book, we've turned our attention to a variety of new practices. And those are the ones that I'm going to talk mostly about today. When the pandemic hit, we have had to shift our focus from face-to-face meetings to online meetings. And within our own research group, we were seeing that many of our members were cooking while they were having our meetings, because the Zoom calls, Zoom cameras would be set up in their kitchen, and they would be working with ingredients. And so because we had earlier done things where people remixed their favorite stories to see how the characters might interact with each other, we then said, what is your favorite ingredient? What is it that you find speaks of your identity, your culture, your community, your family history? And how could we imagine mixing those ingredients together creatively and collectively to create something new? And here are just some of the ingredients that people worked from. And then out of that, people developed recipes. So this is a spicy and sweet hot pot with coffee rubbed beef and Karo syrup, glazed pork belly, chili mangoes, and whip-o-matic coffee for dessert. People gathered the ingredients. They all were in their own kitchen. They remixed them in their own kitchen, and they put it out, and they sampled it, what the results of their own thing, and came up with recipes they thought were fairly compelling and fairly good. But coming out of the pandemic, people are now using this as a kind of party game that opens up conversations about foodways and food histories and family histories that allow people to learn things about each other that they might not have otherwise known. And we're about to publish a special issue of a cultural studies journal called which we're calling Feeding the Civic Imagination, which includes articles from all over about how food connects us and divides us, and how we can build a more constructive relationship through food across cultural differences. One of the young women in our group, a Mexican woman, a woman from Mexico, launched this Instagram project called "What do you feel when you look through your window in the current environment?" What is the experience of feeling that you want to hold on to? And they would combine a picture of what you saw literally out your window and a note to yourself so you remember what you feel, and an instruction to share this with others through social media. A lot more constructive than some of the other ways social media is used. And we've created spaces where these could be cataloged. The heaviest participation, as you can see from this map here, is in the United States and Mexico because of this woman's connections there. But we got responses from other parts of the world. And I'll just share a few of the things people were thinking when they did this activity. Let me minimize you guys. Okay. Currently, we see the world through a screen, but it's important to be able to take a breath and look what we have in front of us, to be able to observe what surrounds us beyond our computer or cell phone, to be able to turn to the outside and let our surroundings distract us of our problems and allow us to have a space within ourselves to reflect and appreciate what we have. I want to hold on to this feeling of appreciation for what I have and what I am. How important it is to look around us and leave all the problems that surround us, even for a while, and allow us to grow and appreciate the world differently, leaving our window behind. Or here's some others. The feeling of comfort and home. I feel the serene but chaotic feeling all together. One feeling that I will forever want to hold on to is the feeling of comfort at home. Or second one writes, when time stops, when I look through my window, I see that I'm not the only person in the world. I imagine all the sensation and emotions that other people might be experiencing. At the same time, I see freedom. I take a deep breath and feel a lot of peace inside. Time stops. The calmness that is radiating, I want to hold on to the calmness. A mellow feeling in my belly, listening to the sound of my grandma making breakfast in the morning while I take a whiff of the sweet smell of French toast. I get a mellow feeling in my belly, as well as eagerness to finally be able to eat after a long night's sleep. Remembering the blue sky and the feeling of home makes me feel safe and happy, which I want to hold on to. So these stories were ways of connecting, of allowing people to take a moment out of their day and, to feel some link to people beyond their windows and to imagine what the world beyond their windows might experience. And often the people who read them, I think, feel something in common with the people who wrote these stories. We're also now thinking a lot about plants. And this is an artist, Jonathan Keats. He's quite a well-known artist. He's encouraged us to think about plants and their invisibility in our culture. The sense that when we look at a photograph, if there's one human image in it, even though the rest of it is a lovely garden, people tend to, when you ask them what's a photograph of, they tend to focus on the person, not the plants. And that has consequences for how we think about the future of our environment. And so we've been working with him to develop a range of activities centered around the environment. So here's, for example, the Sage Project. Walk around the garden of your neighborhood, choose a plant. Imagine the plant's backstory. For instance, you can think about their perspective from where they are, their experiences of how they present themselves. If you have more time, or if the information is readily available, you can also use their lores or scientific colloquial names to reimagine. You draw the plant. What would the plant want us to know? You can add in a written paragraph or a drawing about things. So here are some of those the drawings hanging on the line at a community garden where people came together to think about plants in perhaps a different way. Another activity that we had people do is to write a letter to a plant that you have hurt or damaged or perhaps killed, asking for its forgiveness, and pass it to someone else who writes a letter in the voice of the plant. I know this can kind of feel a little new agey, but it also changes reflexive practices in ways that we think are really helpful. See, we've been interviewing gardeners, amateur artists, other people who connect with plants in really strong ways, but may not have thought of themselves as active environmentalists, right? Or may not have thought of the larger questions of sustainability, but only the local relationship they have with plants. And so these are just a few of the things that we've heard in those interviews. It's a unique thing to watch plants because there's no real instant gratification. Watching them grow takes a long time. It may take 8 years before you get fruit from it. You do build a long-term relationship with plants. Question, what would plants say to us? Response, the first thing they would say is, without us, you're going to be dead. It's like a long-term relationship you take for granted. And again, let me reduce you for a moment. I can't help but wonder if plants are just telling us, you know, it's a trap that you're not watering us. If you gave us more water, we could grow more and absorb more of the carbon dioxide that you're feeding us. When we've heard often in the interviews, we ask them what stories they think about in relation to plants. And one that comes to the surface often is the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. Jack and the Beanstalk, there's something about that fairy tale. I think about planting a seed and then the magic that occurs in your imagination, what the future holds. All of a sudden, you're high above the clouds. I project myself to be the giant in that story because I'm trying to protect the plant from all the pests, dealing with things on the ground. First thing that comes to mind is Jack and the Beanstalk. There's a massive lima bean, like one of the biggest plants that I started growing a couple of years ago. I just got these giant beans growing outside. It makes me think of those magic beans. Or, okay, so those are just 2 examples of what people said. This is another, ask people how they use plants in relation to other people in their family. 7 years ago, I took my father back to New Mexico because it was his favorite place. He wanted to visit one more time before he died. And there was an abundance of hollyhocks. They were just, tall and strong and all those stalks, but many of them are coming to the end of their seasons and only had a few blossoms left. And I remember looking at those and thinking it reminded me a lot of my father. His body was withering away and his bosom has gone. And now he was returning to seed. That's by one of the painters. Another project we worked on in the recent years was for parents. We were hearing that lots of parents were at home with their children. They were working at home. Their children were in school at home. And children were spending a lot of time on screens. And I don't know what the discourse looks like there in Moscow, but in the United States, parents are made to feel guilty every time the kid puts their eyes on a screen. But that screen time prohibition broke down during the pandemic because every major relationship was conducted on screen. So we wanted to develop a guide of activities that parents could do with their children about the things children were seeing on their screens. And a lot of these activities built on experiences some of our research members had within the fan community, how we read stories, rewrite stories, reimagine characters. So how might the characters in one children's show solve the problems facing the characters in a different show? And so there we are moving into a civic framework from shows that are often very individualistic in the ways in which they talk about problems and solutions, and where lasting conflict is necessary for the storytelling, but teach children really some negative ideas about how conflicts get resolved in the world. Lately, we've been finding ourselves sucked into a range of projects involving monuments and memorials. Among other things, we're working with the city of Los Angeles to have a series of meetings across the city, across town, that deal with the prospect of having a memorial to those who were lost during the COVID pandemic. And so how do we commemorate a pandemic? Or as well as the debates that are going on around the country about historic monuments that may not be in keeping with our current cultural mix, right? Some Confederate monuments in the South, monuments to so-called Western heroes who did damage to the Native American population, figuring out how to speak to those events. And these figures who have historically been important to one group in that area, but have been seen in very hostile terms as having done historic harms to other groups in that community. How do we think about changing communities and their futures and their values? And can we come up with new ways to decide what should stand in for our history? The biggest thing we undertook during this period of time, though, was the Atlas of the Civic Imagination. And we sort of invited people to think from a future perspective looking backwards. We went to the year 2060, which is a year we often use in our research. It's not magical. There's nothing particular about the year 2060, other than it's far enough in the future that you can imagine other possible arrangements, other configurations, getting out of political impasses that block civic life at the current time. And yet within the lifetime of most of the people participating in our brainstorms. So we went to the year 2060 and we invited people to look back and say, how did the COVID change the world? And that gets us out of the moment where we're totally embroiled and enmeshed in the pandemic and its effect on our particular community, toward thinking long-term, how do we use the pandemic as an opportunity to rethink some of the core ideas that affect us, some of the institutions that may not be fully serving us. And certainly the healthcare system crops up rather a lot when we start to discuss it. Do we feel doctors and hospitals are fully meeting our needs? So here's the prompt. Think about the current moment, your situation, and what you see around you, your fears and concerns. Take a deep breath, inhale, exhale. Now think about something that inspires you, a story from popular culture, folklore, your faith, your childhood. The story could be nonfiction, fiction, or even fantasy. It could be something you have noticed happening around you. It could be a story about a person in your life. Imagine it is now the year 2060 and the world is as you would have like it to be. What is possible in 2060? How do people live, engage, move around, learn, communicate, work, take care of themselves, etc.? So here's a couple of responses we got. Lilith from Mexico City. We still remember 2020. Keep in mind, they're already still immersed in 2020, but from a future perspective, it's now a memory. People remember how the world stopped and society hit the reset button. We remember tenderly how much damage we caused to our planet and how the pandemic brought us back together, although it physically separated us for a while. Each person sought for each other as they sought for themselves, and it caused an improvement in our environment. It brought changes we never thought could be reached in such a short period of time. Thinking about 2020 reminds us that when working together, marvelous things can be attained. It also humbles us down because the virus took over our lives catastrophically and made us learn how insignificant we really are against nature's simple organisms. Here's a bunch of others. I'm gonna read. In my future world, we would care for one another and our surrounding in a way that has been lost with the age of technology. Within a great situation, we can find the colors within many people who have volunteered within this crisis, people who join together to contribute, people who know that today we need to be stronger and more united. The future world is compassionate, altruistic, and connected. Humanity is united. We respect each other, life, nature, etc. These are kind of themes that are very consistent across responses we got in countries around the world. The sense of a feeling of new connectedness to each other, new compassion for each other, and a sense of environmental consciousness coming out of this, that the environmental factors are things that we need to change. This image of a simple and small community with craft design and tech, a little of culture, a little of nature, a little of technology. And that's very much what those solar punk visions of the future represent. My attempt to construct a hope for the future relies on my inspiration of nature. I think 2060 will be described with these three keywords: climate change consequences, media anxiety, and mature children. Optimism for the future and love for the past is what he says, what Nye says came out of it. We have not made the progress we would have liked, and I cried and feared it for most of my life. We almost ended up killing all the species on Earth. The human project is scarred. Now in the year 2060, I realize that it still wasn't the end. Beauty can be found forward and behind. Nothing was like we were told, and now we look back at our mistakes and achievements. So I love that phrase of looking forward and looking behind, of looking optimism for the future, the love for the past, and living in the present. Here's Kelly from Chandler, Arizona. The future would be eco-friendly, egalitarian, and kind. Perhaps over the next 40 years, people would change their minds and new policies will usher in a golden age unlike any other in history. Maybe this is too optimistic, but this is what I'd like to picture, how I'd like to picture the future. This is how I overcame all the horrible things that are happening today. There are 40 years between now and 2060. That reminds me of the biblical story where the freed slaves from Egypt spent 40 years wandering around the desert before they found the promised land that God had chosen for them. Perhaps some of us will not live until 2060, and it's even more unlikely for our parents, but it's our children and grandchildren who will determine the future, and I hope they will create a future that is much better than the present we live in. So again, we asked people to think about stories that inspired them, and we saw examples of them building on everything from popular culture to historical narratives to religious stories as they did so. But this is a good example of how a story that's already in the culture might inspire people to think differently about the future. Purnima from Delhi, India. 2060, the air is so clean, we take blue skies for granted now. The streets are lined with lush green unruliness. No one trims or edits nature anymore. The only motor vehicles that exist are for public transportation. Money isn't our primary mode of transaction now. We depend a lot more on our neighbors than ever before. Everything is slower. We move at the languid pace of cows. We have the discipline of wasps building their nest. We keep things simple like street dogs. We've understood that we are part of a bigger whole. The trees are kings and queens. They rule us. We live in their shade. And I'm really struck in this one by the just consistent natural imagery here. And this relationship to plants that they're describing, they rule us and we live in their shade, which seems very much rooted in the rural culture and sometimes urban culture of India. This is Steve from Detroit. Upon seeing the down spike in emissions during the pandemic, we drive, fly, and pollute less. The air is cleaner. You could safely swim in the Chicago River. We still aren't perfect. Many of our current problems are still rampant, but we're more conscious of the safety of the people in the world around us. People remember 2020 as a disruption before the new normal. Or Halisu from Illinois. Everyone now lives in a constant state of worry and fear. Now new diseases are emerging and killing vegetation and humans. It's 10 times worse than COVID-19. But it isn't the viruses that are hurting people the most. It's the mental health issues. In an already anxiety-prone world, stress levels rise even more because of the fear of not knowing what will happen. Depression levels are magnified by the end of all humanity situation. So maybe they lost touch with the fact this is meant to be a better future, but they are bringing to the foreground issues that we really need to pay attention to as a society, like how we provide mental health support for all of our citizens. Manny from Atlanta, where I'm speaking to you from now, wrote, "Communication is vital to our survival. Where there's no communication, there can be no community. And where there is no community, there is nothing. Imagine if people were able to thoroughly and attentively listen to someone who did not share their exact same beliefs, backgrounds, and experiences." So this notion of listening to each other came up in people from all over the planet. This is a really powerful letter in which Isabel wrote to her dead sister, Alina. Alina died of COVID. "I hope you're well wherever you are. It makes me thrilled to think that you're reading this with your biggest and most genuine smile. I still remember when you were 22 years old, how excited you got thinking about the future, which kept you up every other night imagining what the world would look like. Things that would exist, things that would change. I would like to tell you that everything has changed, that there are flying cars, that cures for incurable diseases have been found, that poverty has ended and the wars have stopped. But I'd be lying to you. However, some things have changed. We've become more human. As humanity, we face many challenges. After the pandemic that you lived and in which we lost you, we have fought many other and more lethal battles. We struggle to understand the damage caused by our lifestyle of irresponsible consumption. We have bonded with each other, of course. We're no longer filled with hatred, selfishness, and individualism. Pain and necessity have changed us. I know you would have been proud of the transformation we have achieved, and even more so to be part of it. I love you. I miss you. I reminisce of you. Your beloved sister, Isabel." And that is where I will end, but I hope that gives you a little sense of the work we do, how it might be used to renew connections with each other, to imagine and work toward other possibilities, and that it can be used to bridge between groups that otherwise would be ideologically divided, but have things in common at the level of human experience.
Thank
So with
you
that, I'll
very
open up
much.
the question.
Thank you very much, Henry. Уважаемые коллеги, приглашаю вас включить камеры. Пожалуйста, пока не включайте звук микрофонов. И мы начнем с вопросов, которые вы прислали заранее. Несколько вопросов повторялись, поэтому я задам сначала их. Скажите, пожалуйста, Генри, как ваши респонденты представляют себе, воображают образование будущего? И каким вы видите образование в новом мире? Это вопрос от Михаила Черемных и Татьяны Ковалевой.
Well, I think you got some samples of it there. I think there's still a surprising degree of optimism out there about the future and about what kind of world they'd like to live in. I think that there was less ideological divides amongst the people we heard from around the world with the Atlas than we might have imagined. That what people need, good health, a good environment, family, are fairly universal. There are particular versions of it or visions of it, but those things come through. And I think the environment and healthcare were the two themes that played the most on people writing in 2020 as part of that. And they're themes that we hear a lot, which is why we're turning more of our attention to environmental questions right now. In terms of my own vision of the future, I am an incurable optimist. I believe human beings can make a difference in their community and that we can achieve better ways of relating to each other around the planet. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you across Zoom, across the planet, and trying to figure out how our people can have better relations with each other.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Galina Zuckerman, who cheered you just a moment ago. She wrote her question in English, so I will read it in English. How to remain free in a totalitarian society and not let down anyone close to you by defending your own freedom?
I am trying very hard to stay away from the governmental level of politics. So I will define freedom here as the freedom we feel within ourselves, and the freedom we feel within our own communities. And it's a freedom that has to start with respecting each other, respecting those points we disagree with, understanding that the choices we make have consequences for others. And I think that's the spirit of the question that you're asking here. I think that, I think that it's about mutual respect and tolerance enables freedom to emerge in whatever form it's going to emerge in whatever society. I know that some societies, governmental change is not a possibility. And the change that occurs has to be local, has to be grounded in a variety of nonprofit organizations, of community-based organizations, of family units. Those are the sites where change may be possible. And the change starts with imagining better, imagining differently, and using those imaginations to develop a deeper understanding of each other's hopes and aspirations. And then break that down to things that you can change at the level of your community that might lead to a better life for everyone involved.
Thank you very much. There are some more questions on the urge of politics, so I will also ask them. Борис Степанов, который сегодня тоже с нами, спрашивает, в какой степени различия в социальной и политической конституции различных обществ влияют на возможности реализации вашего проекта?
Well, let me talk about that in on a level of American politics, so that and we are, as in the United States, as experiences, and I'm sure you've heard from the news, sharp political divides, conservative versus liberal, Republican versus Democrat, and people of different races not speaking to each other well. There are a variety of organizations in the US, and this is the part you may not have heard, who are working to try across those divides and trying to build bridges. One of the things is to start with radical curiosity, to pull back from trying to convince someone else and toward simply trying to understand where they're coming from and see if you can identify common ground that allows people to reconnect or rekindle, to recognize that our lives are connected. We have no choice but to live with each other, and therefore we need to figure out what we all need in order to live. That's one. And the other is to find a way to use, through imagination, to find that point in the future where in fact our dreams are more strongly connected. And we find the further we go in the future, the less difference those ideological divides actually make. and what people want or desire. There are often not differences in goals, but differences in implementation. How fast, what institution or practice will make the change that we want. But in the long term, the future is important to everyone. Third, we pay respect to traditions, right? So we find the more conservative participants in our workshops often want to hold on to some element of the past. So when we ask them to imagine the world of 2060, that's very threatening to some of them because they imagine they got to get rid of everything in their life. So we start by asking them to bring in an object that is sacred to them, that is a memory object, and to tell the story of that to the rest of the group. So we feel them as human beings connected to families, connected to motherlands, connected to all kinds of traditions. And we acknowledge those traditions and say, now, this is an object you will want to carry with you into the future. It's your talisman. It's your, it helps you to, it's your shaman guide, whatever, that allows you to move into the future and carry with you something that's really important to you. And we found for participants of all kinds of backgrounds, that process of respecting tradition, but moving it forward into a new world enables people across political divides to learn from each other. You have to set up a safe space, which goes back to this idea of radical curiosity. The goal cannot be to convince other people that your vision is right, merely to find those points on which you might agree that might lay the foundation for further discussions. We bracket for the moment the ideological disagreements in favor of the points that agreement might be achieved at. And we accept when we do world building that the future will not necessarily be coherent, that there may be multiple contradictory ideas about the future on the table at the same time, and that we can tolerate each other's different ideas. And we model that in our own practice. So those are just some of the things we do that enable us to speak across political divides between, as I said, the kind of political divides that are making American politics particularly rocky at the present moment.
Thank you very much. I see Boris nodding and maybe agreeing you, or maybe at some point we'll have some more discussion about that. But now I'm moving to the next question. Следующий вопрос от Татьяны Климовой из Москвы. Что для вас было самым неожиданным в групповых формах воображения?
I mean, one thing is a surprising consensus that people start to articulate a consensus and their ideas and discover that a lot more people agree with them than they thought would. And an example of this was we did a workshop in Beirut. We had educators from many Arab countries. Many of the women were wearing hijab. Many of the men were wearing headdress. They were very traditional in their dress and very devout in their religion. When we asked what the ideal world was, they said a complete separation of church and state. They wanted a world, they were devout in their own religious belief, but they wanted a world where their neighbors and their government didn't tell them what to believe. And as an American who had, on their first trip to Lebanon, that was a surprising finding to me. I was really shocked by that on one level. The other thing is cultural differences in how these ideas get expressed. So in America, when we try to talk about this stuff, the tendency is to use comedy, to kind of clown around a bit. When we did this workshop in Beirut, it was intense melodrama. A lot of it was conducted in Arabic, so I didn't always understand what was being said, but I could see the passion. The language of expression was that of soap opera, right? And people were wailing and throwing themselves on the ground, and there was enormous emotional intensity in their visions of the future as they performed them to each other. And that difference in cultural style just sticks with me and leaves me more curious than before about what more I could learn from the people in Lebanon, the people who came from across the Arab world, to whom I have had limited exposure in my life in the United States.
That's very inspiring. Thank you. Еще один вопрос я задам из тех, что прислали заранее, затем перейдем к вопросам в чате. Анна Швец спрашивает, как возможно изучение культур соучастия в случае исторического авангарда, когда нет явных цифровых следов партиципации?
Well, this becomes challenging, right? We can only participate within the institutions and practices which are allowed to us, right? That's a given. I'm never convinced that avant-garde is necessarily the best starting point for participation, right? Historically, it's been a form that is elite, that speaks above the heads of large numbers of people. And I'm personally drawn toward forms of culture that emerge from pop culture or from folk culture that are more widely accessible to a large number of everyday people. So that would be my first advice, is probably not starting with the avant-garde. The second is looking at participation at whatever level it's visible to you. So I think about the story of Black Americans during the Civil Rights Movement who registered to vote at great risk and without any previous experience of that having any impact on their lives. And who did so in part inspired by experiences they had in their church, right? So at the church level, they elected their deacons, right? That they elected the leadership. The deacons are the servants of the church. They're not the pastor. The pastor is appointed. The preacher, minister, or whatever is appointed by the church at large, but the local leadership of the church, the men and women who served the community, were selected and voted on by the members of the congregation. And in doing so, they were able to experience what it might mean to make choices about how they were governed. So I think you look at whatever level that is, where there is some flexibility on choices of who leads, who's, what the policies are and so forth. And that's the starting point for thinking differently about the world.
Thank you very much. У нас осталось еще несколько минут, и давайте перейдем к вопросам в чате. Андрей Теров благодарит вас за интересную лекцию и просит ответить на 3 взаимосвязанных вопроса, поэтому я прочитаю их подряд и надеюсь, что переводчики смогут перевести их довольно быстро. Как преодолевать представления о гражданском, гражданственности, о гражданине, в основе которых лежат лояльность власти государственным органам, которые практически сакрализуются? Это был первый вопрос. Второй вопрос. Можно ли и нужно ли это делать, например, средствами образования? Или это культурно-историческая предзаданность и предопределено историко-генетической памятью народа, менталитетом нации? Третий вопрос. Какие наиболее значимые условия для формирования иного представления о гражданственности и иной гражданственности вы можете назвать, кроме развитого гражданского воображения?
Okay, so there's a lot packed into that question, and if I miss a part, just someone nudge me. I like the connection you drew there between civics and civility. Civility is about how we relate to each other and how we relate to each other with respect. And that cuts to the spirit of what I mean by the civic as opposed to the political. So to me, civics are not created by governments. They're created by the people themselves and their everyday interactions with each other. And that allows us to bracket the government to some degree as we think about what are the civilities we show each other. How do we treat the old? How do we treat the young? How do we deal with children in our society? Do we share what we have with other people? Do we walk past people as if they're strangers, or do we say hello when we walk past them in the town square or the city park? Those are questions of civics and civility that are very important. Here in the US and many parts of the world, there's a confusion in schools between teaching civics and teaching government. And I think there's very separate tasks. But I do think schools have a very active role to play. They are often the place where people come together from different backgrounds, learn to communicate with each other, learn to respect each other. And that stuff that's taught in its kindergarten as kids start school and have to learn to respect kids of different backgrounds and not all try to speak at the same time and not be selfish about the toys and all of that stuff. That lays a foundation that affects our understanding of the social contract we have with each other. Now, yes, that civic's going to be performed differently in different countries and under different political conditions. But it is that sense of needing to depend on each other we can trace throughout human history. And I don't think that mutual dependence is a property of any one country in the way, or any one culture or any one political tradition. At the end of the day, humans have had to depend on each other for food, for water, for mutual protection. And that mutual dependence is the foundation for the civic in a different sense than if we were to try to argue were governments created by God or the people or whatever. We get it deeper into political philosophy and likely more disagreements between people in different nations. But if we look at that common ground we have of how do humans depend on each other to survive, that's the grounding of civics. How do we trust and respect each other so that we can live together? That's a foundation of the civic.
Thank you very much. Henry, will you allow one last question from Ирина Чечел? Thank you very much. Ирина благодарит тоже за прекрасный доклад и спрашивает, есть ли какие-то реалии, с которыми гражданское воображение, как вы считаете, справиться не в силах? Основной ваш подход основывается на представлении, что гражданское воображение может иметь политический и терапевтический эффект в работе с любым типом проблем и конфликтов. Но за этим стоит определенное представление о социальных нормах. Вы говорите о нормальном мире, нормальных состояниях, отработанных методах работы с образами будущего и психологии людей в так или иначе управляемых обстоятельствах, исходя из определяющего представления о том, что любое развитие, которое можно повернуть к прогрессу и благосостоянию, к сочувствию и взаимопониманию. Но в современную эпоху характер социальных проблем и травм становится совсем иным. Мы подчас не можем рассчитывать на нормальные реакции и нормальное воображение в глубоко травмированных обществах. Ну, повторю еще раз вопрос. Есть ли какие-то реалии, с которыми, как вы думаете, гражданское воображение справиться не в силах?
Well, we don't know is the answer, because civic imagination is a relatively new concept and hasn't been tested against all of the systems of government and economic condition, psychological condition in every country around the world. That's point one. Point two is, I think if we follow Paulo Freire, what he's telling us is that civic imagination is a way of surfacing those inequalities so that we can speak about them and understand them and try to route around them or solve them, right? And this is very much what Duncan means when he says that utopia is a provocation, not a blueprint. So we're not assuming that the futures that are being imagined are necessarily futures that can be achieved, but they can tell us something about the world we want to live in and the world the lacks we may experience in our everyday life. And that, I think, is the essence of the civic imagination. For me, thinking of it as a provocation means we can use utopian vision to look back at where we're at now and try to figure out how far we need to travel, what problems we need to address if we're going to live in a world that is at all like the ideal world that we have in our heads, right? It's a yardstick to how much progress we can and have made toward achieving a mutual goal that we all think seems almost common sense, but which we can't get our people toward. And I think that's the essence of it. Now, to take us deeper into the Freire territory, one of the things that crops up often when we talk about the future of transportation is the teleportation system on Star Trek, right? Star Trek has this image of being able to beam people from one place to the other without any other form of physical transportation. And it crops up all over the world, but as it crops up, we hear different stories that speak to different lacks or different desires. So in the United States, it's often connected to carbon footprint. So is beaming someone to another part of the planet less damaging to the environment than flying sheets of metal with fossil fuel, right? That's an interesting question. We don't know, but we can use it to think about and how much environmental accountability there should be on the choices we make over their transportation. In the European Union, we heard a lot about efficiencies. So what's the most efficient way to get from Brussels to Berlin? Is it taking trains that you have to change 3 or 4 times? Or is it just beaming from one city to the next? In the Beirut, we heard about safety because Arab Syrians in particular were dying trying to get by boat to Germany out of the war zone that was taking place there. And so safety was the #1 concern. And if they could just beam there, a lot of those deaths could be avoided. And here in the US, talking to immigrant groups, we heard a lot about borders and walls and papers, which are very much in the air and debates. And as we heard that, they said, you know, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, when they beam down to a planet, they're not passing through gatekeepers. No one's coming up to see if they have the right papers to enter that space. It's an open border world. And so for them, that was an idea that they spoke to. So just as Freire would say that our fantasies tell us about our lacks, each of those stories that were produced told us something about the lacks people felt in their everyday lives. And that's how we can use the civic imagination, not to say, oh, we've imagined a better world and we now live in it, which would be absurd, but to say we've imagined a better world, how close can we get to it? How do we address the problems underneath that have surfaced through this act of imagining together?
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, it's time to finish our meeting. Генри, большое спасибо за эту встречу. Может быть, вы хотите сказать какие-то заключительные слова сегодняшней встречи?
Well, I was honored to have a chance to speak to you. I honestly, speaking from my heart, have come to love the Russian people. And I hope that someday I will be able to sit down with you for more extended conversation on the ground and literally break bread together, because I think that's such an important ritual between strangers.
Мы тоже на это надеемся. Уважаемые коллеги, благодарю вас за то, что присоединились, активно участвовали в разговоре, задавали вопросы. Мне кажется, для нас, для всех сегодня это было очень важное событие во многих отношениях. Ну, Генри, как вы видите, все вам аплодируют и вызывают сердца на расстоянии, но действительно надеемся, что когда-то, может быть, мы окажемся за одним столом и поговорим еще.
Thanks for having me.